Green Room is one of those movies that I went into with relatively high expectations due to the feedback and reviews from people who I respect talking about the film. It is a movie that I wanted to check out for quite a long time, but I just didn't get around to it. I managed to pick up a copy of the film, and I'm really glad that I did. This is a movie which any horror fan I think will enjoy a lot. It's not a monster movie. It's not that kind of horror film. There's no crazy creature chasing you around. There's no aliens invading Earth. It's just not that kind of film. What Green Room is instead of that is a much more grounded, gritty, realistic, even human monster story based around people who aren't necessarily trained or skilled in any particular form of survival or combat, but they are dropped into a situation basically that they don't want to be in. They would have avoided if they could, but they couldn't, and now they can't get out. That is exactly what this film is about. And without spoiling anything, of course, the very basic plot and premise of Green Room revolves around a small, starting out band of kids travelling in a van, trying to get gigs. They play, I believe it's punk music, and although I do personally like forms of metal and rock and that kind of thing, and some punk music as well, I didn't really like the music that they played in the film. To me, it was a little messy in the way it was delivered. Maybe that was deliberate, maybe that was a good delivery of the song, I don't know. I just didn't personally like the music that they were playing that much. But it's not important to the film. It serves the purpose of them being in a position where they have to travel around looking for these gigs. They're not getting paid very much, and they get an opportunity to play at this place, a small, middle of nowhere, crummy little place where people go to check out this kind of music and just enjoy that scene. And that's fair enough. Now they go there, they perform, and they end up walking into something which they wish they hadn't. And basically it escalates from there very quickly. Now the whole film takes place over a relatively short span of time, around say a day or so, maybe give or take a few hours, and I really enjoyed what they did with this film. It's one of those movies which I'm a huge fan of, where you don't have many actors, many characters at play. The situation and the scenario is relatively simple, the location is small and constricted, there aren't exactly ideal weapons to hand, and you just have to survive. And as I've mentioned on the channel before, some of my favourite movies are survival horror films. This is definitely an excellent example of a survival horror movie. One of the best, in fact. I would put this up there with others which I love as well, like Frozen, The Thing, various others like that, Splinter as well, of course, that are underappreciated. Green Room not so much. People do talk about it a bit more than some of those others, but still, this film did not do very well financially speaking. The film had a budget of around $5 million, and it didn't even make 4 back, which is a shame, because this film does definitely deserve to be seen more. But that's not surprising. At the same time, there are a lot of films, especially in the horror category, the horror genre, which don't get the respect and the viewership that they deserve to have. And although that is sad, it really makes those of us who do seek out those films and enjoy them blessed, because you get some really great titles in that kind of undervalued category within the overarching genre of horror. Now, in the film you've got some great actors. You've got Anton Yelchin in what you could say is the primary role, and rest in peace to him. He died very tragically in real life not all that long ago. This is one of his last, if not his last film. And you've also got other great actors in there as well, and actresses. Imogen Poots is also in there as well. I'm not a huge fan of her work overall, but I've seen her in a few things here and there. And of course you've got Patrick Stewart, probably most notably in the film. He's kind of the big name that draws the people that did see the film to see the film, and he's fantastic as a villain. He played a great role as the villain in the film. He's not a big, over-the-top, crazy kind of villain. He's a singularly focused, methodical, efficient villain, and he was superb. I mean, it's Patrick Stewart, of course he was superb. But I really liked what they did with him as a character. As I said, he was restrained, and that gave him more of an effectiveness as a killer, in a similar way to Tobin Bell as Jigsaw in the Saw films, but I would say even better than that. Not because of just the performance, but just because of the rest of the packaging of the film, I would say, comes off better than many of the Saw films do, as much as I love them. And that brings us now then to my personal individual scores for the film. 5 categories, which we individually score, then put those 5 scores together to give the film an overall rating out of 5. And first of all, of course, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Green Room, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. That's not remarkably high, but it is definitely above par. And the reason why I'm giving it a 7 in particular is because, although, as I said, the story itself is relatively simple, they don't really do anything mind-blowing with the story of the film. That's not really the point of the film, it's more realistic than that, but what they do with it is effective, the tension is fantastic, the atmosphere of the film is so dense with dread, and it's a realistic kind of dread. The film doesn't deliver horror in an over-the-top way. It delivers it in a worryingly realistic kind of way. The deaths, the violence, the tone, the people, the methods that they use, the savagery involved in the film, they're all very, very realistic. You may not ever be in a scenario like this, but the things that happen in the scenario have no doubt happened to different people in different scenarios combined. So overall, for me, what they did with such a simple idea was very good. And that brings us up next to, of course, the characters, their motivations, the portrayals of them by the actors. And for that category, I'm going to give it a strong 9 out of 10, because they're fantastic. Now, there are some character choices in particular, and some, not necessarily reactions, but the way that people deal with certain scenarios in the film, which I didn't like. And although you could say, well, in the scenario, when you've got a decision a fraction of a second in front of you, you've got to make a choice, you're not always going to make the best choice. And that's fair enough. But there were certain scenes in particular, and certain defensive choices made in certain scenes, which I didn't like. I couldn't take it seriously enough. In particular, I'll be specific, and this isn't a spoiler, but in particular with certain attack dogs that are used in the film. They are used quite prominently as you get into the movie more, and I found that hard to go along with. And that's more of a personal thing, because I've never found dogs to be intimidating, and I don't see how anyone really could. Maybe if you're a small person, or you consider yourself to be weak, I guess you could consider a dog intimidating, but I've never met a dog that I did feel was intimidating, and that if it came to it, I couldn't kill. So I found that a bit of an issue for me personally with the film, that the dogs were given so much presence in the film that for me they just didn't deserve, they didn't earn that. And it kind of played on this misjudgment that people have for a certain breed of dogs, pit bulls specifically, which I did not like. Having owned a pit bull, it wasn't realistic. You can train dogs to be a certain way, but I don't know, I just wasn't a fan of the way that they were used in the film. If it were another dog, maybe, maybe not, but overall, as I said, I just can't take dogs that seriously. Even in films where the dog is the star, like Cujo, I just can't really take those films that seriously because I love dogs, and to me a dog just isn't as dangerous as films present them as being. In a pack, maybe, that's fair enough, but this film doesn't feature dogs in a pack, it's just one-on-one. So in that scenario, it just didn't really work for me. As far as the rest of the characters and their decisions, etc. though, they're fantastic. I already covered the fact that I loved Patrick Stewart's villain. I love the primary characters. It takes a little while, I think, at the start of the film to get into the characters. They're not necessarily the most likeable of people initially, but I think the situation which really endears you to them, rather than them just as people. You care about them more on a moral level rather than a specific person-to-person level. And what I mean by that is you feel for them because of the situation that they're in, but not necessarily because you would be friends with any of them. There are some films where that is the case. You like the people, you want them to live. Whereas with this film, I found it to be more of just an anger against the injustice of the situation that made it effective, rather than loving any of the characters or wanting them to survive longer than others. But overall, I love the characters, I love the casting, it's an easy 9. That brings us next, of course, to the visuals, the special effects, etc. And for that, I'm actually going to rate the film even higher, a full 10 out of 10. And the reason why I'm giving it that full 10 is actually kind of twofold. Because for one thing, the violence and the gore in the film was very well done. It was done with practical effects, makeup, and it was very realistic looking. It was effective. It wasn't necessarily stomach-turning for me personally, but it certainly would be for some people. And it was great. It looked fantastic. Your eyes were glued to it. And there was enough of it for it to really showcase what the guys behind the film were capable of. Then the second factor at play was the fact that I really liked how realistic the violence and gore in the film was. It wasn't presented in this over-stylized, typical Hollywood way, which unfortunately does bleed over to many horror films where you can't have an explosion without a ridiculous cinematic flash, you can't have a gunshot without an overly ridiculous sound effect added, or clips flying across the room, people getting blasted backwards by shotguns, stuff like that. This film doesn't do that. Green Room presents its violence and its gore in a very, very effective and very realistic and almost understated way. And when you watch the film, if you're not as much of a horror fan as perhaps I am, you may think, what does he mean by understated? This is pretty intense violence. And it is. What I mean by understated is that there's no pomp and ceremony to it. As I mentioned with the overuse of guns, explosions, that kind of stuff in typical Hollywood films, this film doesn't do that. When you kill someone in the film or maim them, as happens quite a lot, there's no ceremony to it. They're just dead. That's it. That's the end of it. They're left. Even the characters who you may want to live on either side of the equation, they just die. They don't get a second chance. They're just dead. And I like that. It was realistic, it gave the film more stakes, and it was one of those movies where it was not predictable. You don't know who's going to live and who's going to die. And I really enjoyed that. So overall for me, the visuals, the effects in particular, the makeup, and also just the overall look of the film, the scenario that they're in is quite visually rich. It almost had, for me personally, kind of a fun house kind of feel, at a circus, with all this graffiti on the walls and strobe lighting and loud music, almost like that kind of psychedelic, as I said, fun house kind of appearance, and it really worked for me. And at the same time as having that kind of fun house flair, it did still feel suitably claustrophobic. So I loved the visual style and methods of the film very much. And that brings us next up, of course, to the audio of the film, the sound design, the soundtrack, the music used, the music for the film, that kind of thing. And overall, I'm going to give it a 6 in that regard. And the reason why I'm giving it a 6, which is the lowest score of the 5 overall, is because although I did like the sound design of the film, I liked the soundtrack, I liked the sound effects, there were certain things about it which I found to be a little annoying, especially at the start of the film. I found the music that the band themselves were playing to be quite annoying, and although it served the purpose at the time, I just quite simply didn't enjoy it. Later on in the film, the soundtrack was better, but at the same time, I didn't find it overly memorable, so it just wouldn't be fair to films with really good music to rate it even higher. And so overall, for the sound effects, the sound design, soundtrack, music, all that kind of thing, I'm giving it a 6. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment factor, which of course is the most personal to me, I'm going to give Green Room an 8, which is pretty high. That is one of my slightly higher scores as far as my film reviews go, and I think it has a lot of rewatchability. It's not necessarily the kind of film that I'll watch very, very frequently, but at the same time I will definitely check it out numerous times. It is a film which I would strongly recommend to fellow horror fans, and it's a film that does have some, I would say, group rewatchability. And overall, that means that as a tabulation of all 5 of our categories put together, I'm giving Green Room a very, very respectable 4 out of 5, which is one of the higher scores that I've given 2 horror films on the channel, so that's a very respectable score as far as my scoring system goes, and it goes without saying that obviously I would definitely recommend checking out Green Room if you're a horror fan, if you're a fan of survival horror, if like me you enjoy films with just a few people in a small scenario. It's a great example of that, so definitely check it out if that sounds like it appeals to you, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.